So, in terms of talking about Thomas Hobbes, I want to begin by having a conversation about his life. And here I'm kind of going off the page that says From Classics of Moral and Political Theory, edited by Michael Morgan. So Hobbes was born in 1588, dies in 1679 in Malmesbury, England. Okay? And basically what ends up happening is that his mother goes into early labor because the Spanish Armada is attacking the British coast, right? And so she's so overwhelmed with fear that she goes into early labor and the young Thomas is born. His father was a parson, right? A minor poor clergyman. And he ends up getting into a fisticuff altercation. It's unclear whether the person that he attacked survived the attack, but nevertheless, he basically gets into a fist fight outside of the church, and he has to run and go on the lam. So at that point, Hobbes's uncle steps forward and basically says, okay, well, Thomas still needs to be educated, even though his father is gone. How are we going to do this? So he pays for Thomas to go to Oxford. And Thomas had already established himself as a good student. So he goes to Oxford, he gets good grades, but he knows that when he comes out of Oxford, he's going to need to find himself a job, right? He's not going to be able to just live a life of leisure. So at this point, he ends up being taken into the household of William Lord Cavendish, the Earl of Devonshire. And it should be mentioned at this point that in the 1600s, if you were rich, you would eventually send your children to the university. But before then, you would have tutors that lived on your estate. And it would be those tutors' responsibility to educate your children and possibly help around the estate in other ways, right? Like working as a secretary or something like that. So Hobbes comes in to the Cavendish family through that route and basically remains associated with the Cavendish family for the rest of his life, okay? They were basically his benefactors, his protectors, however you want to put it, okay? Even after he's no longer required as a tutor, he still remains as part of the retinue of the Cavendish family. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail over the history of what is going on in the 1600s in England, but if you were to take a British history course, this is a very tumultuous time. For our purposes, what you need to understand is that there were two people who both were trying to become king of England. And the Cavendish family, being an important family at this time, definitely had a horse in this race, right? There was a king that they wanted to win. So when Hobbes writes his famous book, The Leviathan, it should be kept in mind that part of what he's trying to do is not just give a justification for government, but he wants to give a justification for government that is going to suit the requirements of the Cavendish family, right? I mean, Hobbes knows where his bread is being buttered, pardon the expression. He's not going to want to go against the Cavendish family, okay? Now, along the way, he manages to piss off everyone, okay? He manages to piss off the monarchists, he manages to piss off the parliamentarians, he manages to piss off the religious folks, and we'll talk a little bit into more depth as to why it is that both the monarchists and the parliamentarians end up going against Hobbes once we get a little bit into greater detail of his theory. But basically what ends up happening is that, at some point there were threats against him, and he ends up hiding out in Europe, on the continent for a while. Eventually, he's able to come back to England. There are still threats being made against him, but he manages to die of natural causes at roughly the age of 90. Okay? As I said earlier, the major question that Hobbes is trying to answer is, how do we justify government? Briefly, Hobbes' main position is that we can understand something about the legitimacy of the state by hypothesizing a state of nature. In other words, what society or culture might have looked like absent government. Now, I need you to understand that the state of nature The state of nature is a thought experiment. It's not a real place. It didn't exist historically. The idea is that we're going to think about, right, thought, what would the world be like in the absence of government? Now, obviously, in order to think about what is the state of nature going to require, we have to have some understanding of human nature, right? Because we're talking about what humans would be like absent government. Obviously, that's going to be quite different than what might angels behave like absent of government. So, human nature being a theme that we've had all semester, it's a good idea to understand that Hobbes' view of human nature is one of psychological egoism. What does it mean to be an egoist? If someone accuses you of being egotistical.
Self-centered.
Self-centered, only concerned with your own point of view. Okay, good, Zach. So why would we call it psychological egoism? Hobbes is basically going to argue that we do what we believe to be in our best interest. But could I be wrong about what's in my best interest, potentially? Sure, why not? So let's say that I decide that for breakfast, I'm going to eat an entire chocolate cake and a pound of bacon. Now, as I'm sitting down and eating it, I believe that it's in my best interest. But is it actually in my best interest? What's my doctor going to say about whether that's in my best interest? She's going to say, I'm concerned about your cholesterol. You're going to need a quadruple bypass, right? I'm concerned about your risk of diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. So the point here is that human nature in Hobbes' view is that we do what we believe to be in our best interest. But because he's a philosopher, he still thinks that I am rational, right? Which means that I can come to understand that what I want may not necessarily be what's in my best interest. And that's going to become important in just a second. So the state of nature on Hobbes' view is going to be a permanent state of war for resources, because he's extremely pessimistic about human nature and what humans are like. So in one of his most famous lines, he describes human life as, quote, dirty, nasty, brutish, and short. And specifically, he thinks that human beings are going to be in a permanent state of war. Why? Well, because in the state of nature, there is no morality. The only thing that exists in the state of nature is what Hobbes calls the right of nature. And the right of nature is basically the right for you to use violence in order to get whatever it is that you believe is necessary in order for you to survive. So I look across the room and I notice that Jessica, no, in front of you, with the yellow earrings?
Me?
Yeah.
No, Brandy.
Brandy, I'm so sorry, I was really off.
It's okay.
Okay, so I noticed that Brandy is wearing some gorgeous earrings, okay? And I decide, you know what? I just can't live without her earrings. So in the state of nature, what am I going to do? I'm going to kill her to take her earrings. And you might say, well, wait a minute, right? Cole might jump in and say, but do you really need her earrings in order to live? I mean, it's not water or food or shelter. Doesn't matter. Hobbes' position is that I can use violence in order to gain for myself whatever it is that I believe is necessary for my life. So if I'm really serious about the fact that I can't live without Brandy's earrings, then if I have the power to kill her and take them in the state of nature, I do. So the state of nature is going to be a permanent state of war. Now, Hobbes argues that this is greatly equalizing. We are all equal in this state of nature. Not because we were all equally made in the image of God, or because we all have souls which make us equal. No, nothing so lofty as that. We are all equal in the state of nature because we are all equally scared. Because any of us, right? I mean, my earrings are pretty fabulous too. So maybe as I'm trying to kill Brandy for her earrings, she ends up killing me for mine, right? And you might say, well, wait a minute, is everybody going to be equally scared? What about The Rock, aka Dwayne Johnson? Is he going to be as scared in the state of nature as I am?
No.
You might initially think not, but Hobbes is going to say, look, a group of people with the same capabilities could come together in a conspiracy and overcome even the strongest individual. And in your Hobbes supplemental reading taken by from the Donald Palmer text, you see that Palmer has drawn a vignette for you, right? And it's taken from Gulliver's Travels. But it's the scene where Gulliver finds himself having been tied up and taken over by the Lilliputians. And the idea that Palmer is trying to get across with regards to Hobbes is that even somebody as strong as Gulliver, right? Even somebody as strong as The Rock, if enough people got together, that person could be overpowered, right? Everybody has to sleep sometimes. So even The Rock is going to be equally scared in the state of nature. Okay? Now, it should be mentioned here that there is a feminist critique of this, because it basically argues that Hobbes's view of the person is what is sometimes called the punctual self. Not punctual in the sense that you show up on time everywhere, but punctual in terms of a point. And the idea here is that you basically think of the person as being fully formed and being fully capable of constantly making a threat on people. But the reality of the situation is that many of us are vulnerable, especially in certain phases of our lives. So, for example, would it make sense for The Rock to be scared of 20 toddlers that are coming towards him? Would 20 toddlers be able to make a credible threat against The Rock? Doesn't seem that way. Or how about 20 women who are about to give birth? Right? Like they're just waiting for their water to break and they're trying to waddle towards The Rock. Are they going to be able to be a threat to him?
Eventually.
In that moment.
In a couple of years, it'll be 20 past pregnant ladies and 20 toddlers.
Potentially, but in that moment, they're not going to be able to be a threat. So what the feminist critique is saying here is, look, all of us are vulnerable at some point in our life. We're not vulnerable for 100% of our lives, but we are vulnerable at the beginning of our life. Do any of you read The Onion? There was a brilliant Onion piece that was comparing a 3-month-old baby to a 3-month-old wolf cub. And it was saying things like, if you put a 3-month-old baby in the snow, all the baby does is just sit and cry, while the wolf cub is able to leap out of the snow and seek shelter. There is a certain amount of, really, human beings are only somewhat self-sufficient by the time that we get to be, what? 5, 7, 40, you know, and then all of us can be struck down by illness, right? So I apologize for having been absent, but I was in a situation where I was really sick. I didn't think I was going to be. I was going to run a quick errand and meet my mom at the tax office, and then I pulled out of the parking lot and I had to open the door of my car and I just started vomiting. And I couldn't, do anything. You know, my mom is calling me saying, I have the number for you at the tax office. Are you coming? And I'm like, Mom, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to clean up my car enough so that I can close the door so that I can drive it back into the parking lot, right? I'm not going anywhere. And thankfully, she was kind enough to come and visit me and help me clean up the car because I was really scared of having anything to do with that because I thought it might make me sick again, right? So she came and took care of me. Now, especially the care ethics perspective from feminism says that this is something that is a part of human existence. That at the beginning of life, we are vulnerable. At various times in our lives, we are vulnerable, especially pregnant women. And it should be mentioned that pregnancy is a condition that can be forced upon a woman if one is intent on trying to keep her enslaved. potentially. And all of us can suffer illness throughout our lives. And then at the end of our life, many of us become somewhat incapacitated. So, yes, we can be a threat to people in certain parts of our life, but no human being is going to able to be constantly a threat to everyone in all parts of their life, right? So when you think of The Rock when he was still a 2-year-old, the pebble, right? Was he able to be a threat towards somebody else? Probably not, okay? Now, getting back to the state of nature, Hobbes argues that the state of nature is a permanent state of war, right? It's a permanent state of threat, because the right of nature says that I can take whatever it is that I believe I need in order to survive. And what's going to happen here is that everybody's going to be constantly fighting, okay? So here is my stick figure drawing of people constantly fighting. That's a person with a sword, and they're fighting, right? You've by now gotten used to the fact that my chalkboard heart leaves something to be desired. Okay. So in order to understand why it is that human beings cannot cooperate in the state of nature, and also the necessity for cooperation, a variant on the prisoner's dilemma may be helpful, okay? Now I need a few volunteers from the audience, please. Don't all jump in all at once. Okay, Patience is one volunteer. Who else? You don't have to get up. You can just stay in your desk. Does that make it easier to volunteer? Okay, Patience and Jacob. So Patience, here's what's going to happen. In the state of nature, even though it's a permanent state of war, even though people are constantly attacking you using the right of nature, you have somehow managed to find an amount, a field, right? Some land that can be cultivated. You have managed to plant and bring in 3 acres of corn, okay? Now, you're getting ready to harvest that corn, but there's a small problem. You can't harvest all 3 acres of corn by yourself quickly enough that the corn doesn't rot, okay? So as you're trying to pick as much corn as you possibly can, Jacob comes walking down the road, and he sees you picking the corn, and he stops to say, "Hello there. May I help you pick some of the corn and keep some of it for myself in payment for my labor?" Okay? Now let's say for the sake of argument that the two of you agree on a price, okay? Whatever you want it to be. 10% of the corn that Jacob picks, he gets to keep, right? Now here's the problem. Patience, do you really want to pay Jacob to pick your corn if you could get away with just having him pick the corn for free? No, not really. And Jacob, do you really want to work for the corn? Like, if you could get the corn for free, wouldn't you rather have that? So you both know this about each other, right? Jacob knows that if he picks the corn, there's the possibility that Patience is going to bash him over the head with a rock and just kill him at the end of it so she doesn't have to pay him. And Patience knows that Jacob might just at any time take payment and just run, okay? So you might say, well, I don't want to be paid. I don't want to work unless I've been paid up front. And she might say, I'm not paying you until after you've worked. And the problem is that because you both know that what you really want is something for nothing, you're not going to be able to cooperate. So what's going to happen to the corn? It's going to rot. Now this goes back to this notion that we're psychological egoists, but we're rational. Can every human being understand that it's in nobody's best interest for the corn to rot? Yes. So Hobbes' point here, I mean, we're talking about it in terms of corn and farmers, but he's talking about it in terms of any human endeavor that makes us great, right? He's going to give us examples like navigation, require cooperation. And the problem with the state of nature is that because it is a permanent state of war, cooperation is not possible. Okay, now we need another volunteer. Zane, I saw your hand first. Cole, don't worry, we'll sneak you in later. So Zane is going to come along, and he is going to become the sovereign. And he's going to make it possible for us to enter into the state of civility, okay? So pretend that this is a throne, and Zane is sitting on it, and he's got a crown, right? He's the sovereign. Okay, So now what's going to happen is that we're all going to take our right of nature. We're going to ball it up. Come on, kinesthetic learners. I'm going to wait until you all take your right of nature and ball it up. Okay, not you, Zane. You're going to do nothing. But we're all going to take our right of nature and we're going to throw it at Zane. So now Zane remains in the state of nature. He retains the right of nature, but none of us have any right of nature. We have no right to violence. So now Patience and Jacob agree that Jacob is going to get paid 10% of the corn. Now, if Patience you do the work and Patience doesn't pay you, what are you going to do? You're going to go to Sovereign Zane, right? And then Sovereign Zane is going to go to Patience and threaten to like kneecap her if she doesn't pay Jacob. Similarly, Patience, if he doesn't show up to work or tries to take more money than or more corn than you agreed to, what are you going to do? You're going to go to Zane, and Sovereign Zane is going to come in and say, no, Jacob, you do what you were supposed to do according to this contract, or I'm going to kneecap you. Okay? So Hobbes claims that we consent to go from the state of nature to the state of civility. And the reason why we had a topic on sexual consent last time leading up to this is because I want us to take a moment to think about what kind of consent do we have here. So turn a second to a classmate and talk about it. What kind of consent do you think Hobbes is describing in this situation?
Like we're all like, yeah, okay, fine.
Okay, so let's talk about this as a class as a whole. In order for it to be active consent, you would have to have a situation where somebody came to you and said, do you consent to government? And you would nod your head. Has that happened to anybody? Okay, I'm actually the exception to that because I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen. So as a matter of fact, I was asked to uphold the U.S. Constitution. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I agreed to consent to all of government, right? So active consent is going to be no. Now, tacit consent would say that you consented by not dissenting. And to a certain extent, we could make the argument that, okay, I'm under government and I choose not to leave, right? That's the argument that Socrates makes in the Credo as to why he has to obey the laws. And some people think that that's what Hobbes is up to here, but I disagree. I think that that much more accurately has to do with the philosophies of John Locke. And if you're interested in reading the second treatise on government, we will do that in social and political philosophy, which will be available to you as the second semester of this course, basically, in the fall. Okay? What is Hobbes up to here? He paints a picture of the state of nature that all of us reject. So nobody asked us if we would prefer the state of civility. But if someone had asked, we would all say yes. So what kind of consent are we talking about here? Hypothetical. Okay? That's part of the reason why Hobbes paints such a negative picture of the state of nature. If you compare him, for example, to John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, both give a much more positive view of the state of nature than Hobbes does. But Hobbes paints a very bleak view of the state of nature which then causes all of us to say, okay, nobody asked me, but I don't want to live in, pardon my language, this hellhole. I'm going to live in the state of civility. Okay? So recall, the state of nature, not a real place, never historically happened. The whole point is to posit the existence of this thing in order to say, do we all agree that's awful? Yes. That means that we would prefer to live in the state of civility, and hence we have hypothetically consented to government. Now, Hobbes is going to claim that we retain our right to self-defense because we had it in the state of nature, and it is in our rational best interest to enter the state of civility, but the only situation in which you would be better off in the state of nature than in the state of civility is the situation where somebody is coming at you. Who normally comes at me with a machete in this class?
I think it was her.
Okay, so Rama is going to come at me with a machete. Now, what am I supposed to do in the state of civility?
Die.
I'm supposed to go to the sovereign, right? So I say, Sovereign Zane, come and save me from the person who's coming at me with a machete. And in the meantime, since he's all the way in the back of the room, what's going to happen? I'm dead. So what ends up happening in that situation is that instead I say, okay, in the moment that she's coming at me with a machete, I'm going to revert back to the state of nature. I'm going to defend myself, possibly by killing her, and then when I'm done with that, I'm going to revert back to the state of civility. So this is why it is acceptable for me to defend myself in a situation where someone is directly threatening me, whether in the form of a state executioner or a mugger. By the way, state executioner, the last job you want under the Hobbesian sovereign. Because everybody that you're trying to execute is going to try to kill you back. Right? Now, remember what I said about Hobbes manages to piss everybody off? Let's talk about why. Hobbes argues that the sovereign is just as selfish as anyone else. In fact, maybe a little more so. Because Zane, what we want from you as a sovereign is we want you to be ruthless, right? If Patience isn't paying Jacob for his corn, we want you to go and kneecap her. If Jacob isn't doing his work, we want you to go and kneecap him. So when you hear Hobbesian sovereign, I want you to think Tony Soprano isn't quite thuggish enough for this job. Okay, that's the mental image that I want you to have. And part of it is that, I need to put this on a different part of the board, but you all write down the notion of the divine right of kings. So the monarchists believe that the king is picked by God to lead the people, right? The king is supposed to be virtuous and will pass laws that are in the best interest of the people, for he has been picked by God in order to lead us. Hobbes says, I don't think so. The king, the sovereign, is just as much a thug as we are, more so. And that's how we want it. Because what we want from the king is somebody who's going to be strong enough to be able to enforce, right, force contracts, and hence keep the peace. So the sovereign is going to be ruthless. Okay, well, the monarchists don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that their king isn't any better than anybody else's king, right? Their king is picked by God. So they don't like Hobbes. Hobbes is also going to piss off the parliamentarians, right? The parliamentarians say, well, in order for our government to be justly arranged, we need to have a parliament. Okay. Remember that Hobbes thinks that we are all psychological egoists. So what kind of laws is the sovereign going to pass?
Ones that are good for them.
Ones that are good for them. Very good, Jess. So, Zane, let's say that you get a little greedy and you decide to pass a 90% taxation rate. All of us have to pay 90% of what we make to you. Okay. Now, Cole, remember I had said that you were going to volunteer a little later. So Cole hears about this 90% taxation rate and says, I don't think so. There's no way that I can survive if I'm giving 90% of everything I make to Zane. So Cole, what are you going to do?
Not pay it.
Take him out. And you're going to be, now here's the thing that's interesting for Hobbes. If you succeed in taking him out, then your revolution, because it was successful, was also moral. If you fail in taking him out, then tomorrow morning, Sovereign Zane is going to go onto his balcony and say, an evil attack on my life was made, but it was thwarted. If Cole wins, then Cole is going to step out on the balcony and say, I am the new sovereign. Okay? Now let's say that Cole manages to take out Zane and becomes the new sovereign. Is he going to put 90% taxation rates in place? No, because he realizes that if he puts in 90% taxation rates in place, then Juliana is going to come and kill him and she's going to become sovereign, right? And Cole, you want to keep your head and your shoulders firmly attached. So what rate of taxation are you going to put in place?
Do a solid 15.
15%. You're like, okay, I want to make a little bit of money, but I really just want to stay alive. Okay? So the idea is, Hobbes says, look, when people pass laws, they're going to pass laws that are in their own best interest. The only check on that is the possibility of assassination. So we should have one, maybe at most 3 sovereigns. Anything more than that, and it becomes too difficult to kill them all at once, and there's no threat on their life, and then they're going to go back to 90% taxation rates. So the problem with Parliament, on Hobbes' view, is that you're going to have too many sovereigns. How many sovereigns do we have in our society?
Too many.
I mean, let's try to come up with a number, though. I mean, there's the president and the vice president and the cabinet and the Supreme Court, and then all of the senators, 100 of them, 434 House representatives. Then we get to the Texas government, right? Lieutenant governor, governor, senators, House reps.
20,000.
Too many is Hobbes' view. Because the problem is that they're going to pass laws that are in their own best interest, but there's not going to be any check on their power because there's no way that we can possibly assassinate them all at once. So Hobbes pisses off the monarchists because he goes against the divine right of kings by saying that the sovereign is just as ruthless as the rest of us, maybe more so. He goes against the parliamentarians because he argues that if we have a parliament, every member of parliament will pass laws that are in their own best interest, and there will be no check on their abuse of power. So notice that this is a relativist position, because on Hobbes' view, power gives you the ability to make laws. And it's laws which dictate morality. There is no morality in the state of nature. There's only the right of nature. But in the state of civility, once you have the power, you pass laws. And then those laws in turn dictate morality. Now, the reason why this is relativist is because Hobbes is going to argue that depending on who is sovereign, they're going to pass different laws. So let's say that Sovereign Zane has a vegetable farm. And so he decides that he's going to pass a law requiring everybody to be vegetarians, right? That way we're stuck having to buy vegetables from him. So under Sovereign Zane, vegetarianism is good, eating meat is bad, right? Because he has the power to pass the laws which in turn dictate morality. Okay, then Cole overthrows Zane, and let's say for the sake of argument that Cole owns a cattle ranch. So what kind of laws is Cole going to pass? Meat eating is required, right? Hamburgers for breakfast. And he has the power to pass the laws which in turn are going to dictate beef eating morality. So under Zane, vegetarianism was good. Under Cole, beef eating is good. Right?
He's a defeatist.
So remember that the sovereign remains in the state of nature with regards to other sovereigns, okay? So sovereign Cole, let's say that the classroom next door has a really awesome projector, and you decide that we need that projector. What are we going to do?
Claim it.
How are we going to claim it?
Take it.
Okay, they must have another sovereign, right? So we're going to blow a hole through the wall and go declare glorious war against that sovereign, right? And if we win, then the projector was ours and we were moral, right? And now those people are going to be under sovereign Cole. If we lose,
We're all dead.
sovereign Cole is probably dead and we're all going to be under the other sovereign. So in international relations, right, in just war theory, the position that states act in accordance with their direct selfish best interest is referred to as the realist position. But usually it's really more specifically referred to as the Hobbesian realist position. Because Hobbes basically says that the sovereign remains in a permanent state of war in relation to every other sovereign, right? So the moment that our sovereign decides that they want oil or olive trees or a projector or whatever it is that the other nation has, then we go to war in order to attain those resources.
So it goes from a state of nature explaining how chaos, the chaotic values, it explains the state of stability, which is a great about that, but even in that state, the sovereigns are still getting back to the state of nature.
Well, not quite. So in the state of civility, the sovereign is the only person who remains in the state of nature. Because A, the sovereign has the ability to use violence at any time, right? Notice that the state is violent. The state just claims to have a legitimate monopoly on violence. What allows Jacob and Patience to be able to cooperate with each other is that neither can kill each other, but they both know that Zane could use violence against them. Okay? So the sovereign retains their ability to use violence. They retain the right of nature, which means that they remain in the state of nature vis-a-vis other sovereigns. But their subjects are in the state of civility, unless the sovereign is trying to kill you. And then you revert back to the state of nature, use that to defend yourself, and then go back to the state of civility. So part of the question is, okay, well, why do we obey laws that we know are not in our best interest? Why do we think that those laws dictate morality when we know that those laws actually represent the interests of those who are in power? And Hobbes' answer is, because I am still better off giving 15% of my money to coal than I would be if I were in the permanent state of war. I know that coal is passing laws that are not in my best interest, but nevertheless, that is preferable to me than being in a permanent state of chaos. So I accept that this power is going to dictate laws, which in turn dictate morality, even though that morality is not, as a matter of fact, in my best interest in terms of the individual laws that are passed. That is still better than being in the state of nature. Other questions?